All right, good afternoon, everybody. One of our viewers put a comment below on my last video asking that I should talk about, he wouldn't spell out the whole word Talmud, I'm not sure why, and talk about racism and what he claims is in there, and pedophilia that he claims in there, or other disgusting and horrible things that are claimed to be in the Talmud. I have what to speak about this because I've studied the entire Babylonian Talmud from cover to cover. Every day I learn 2 pages, which is actually 4 pages, 2 sides of a page twice, so it's 4 sides of a page that I learn every day, plus another half a page of another tractate. So I'm learning, 5 pages or 2.5 daf a day, most days, plus 3 chapters of Mishnah. I know the Mishnah pretty well. Gemara, I've been through it. A lot of those tractates I've learned several times. I am not an expert in the Jerusalem Talmud, but I study it also. I try a little bit every night. A little bit more difficult, not what we're used to. But I would say, certainly, for here on YouTube, I have, I might not be the greatest Talmudic scholar. I'm not even close. But I know enough to offer apologetics to these types of claims. And there's a few approaches that have to be taken, and I'm not trying to confuse anybody. I'm trying to be honest. But the first thing is you have to understand what the Talmud is. Now, there is the greater Talmudic tradition, or the general rabbinic tradition, meaning all of the various commentaries upon commentaries that exist, as well as the codifications of Jewish law, such as Maimonides, the Shulchan Aruch, which is classically known as the Code of Jewish Law, and the others. I can say unequivocally that there is no support for pedophilia in the Talmud. It is absolutely prohibited, clearly. All forms of pedophilia, doesn't matter whether it's intercourse, doesn't matter whether it's fondling or anything. It is 100% clear that all of these actions are sinful, evil, and forbidden. Unequivocally. What confuses a lot of people is that there's statutory discussions about the consequences, often the consequences to the victim, as to what kind of consequences there could be. Essentially, that's really what it comes down to. And so often things are mistranslated, taken out of context, not only in this matter, but in all kinds of matters in the Talmud. I'll give another example that's not as disgusting and upsetting as this one, but it's nonetheless a gross misrepresentation of what the Talmud is teaching. There's a very famous statement in the Talmud, which is codified into Jewish law, in the Code of Jewish Law, Aseh Shabbat Chol Al Tistarech Lebrios, which literally means make thy Sabbath a weekday and do not become needy to the creatures, meaning, when I mean creatures, meaning other human beings that are created by God, which would mean to say it's better to make your Sabbath like a weekday than to beg, for charity, or to need to take charity. If there's no choice, it is what it is. But don't find yourself becoming a charity case on account of something to do with the Sabbath, is what it would seem. I mean, it's clear, but the question is, what are we talking about with the Sabbath here? The traditional understanding there, and again, you need to look at the commentaries to really know this, although it's kind of obvious from the context, is that, and from just basic Torah knowledge, from just basic biblical knowledge, is that what we're talking about here is celebrating the Sabbath with expensive food, etc. That if spending money on expensive food for the Sabbath makes one become impoverished, so then it's better to not spend as much, even though there seems to be a contradictory statement that says that whatever you spend for the Sabbath isn't deducted from your account that's set aside at the beginning of the year, which is another statement. So these two seem to contradict each other. But it's talking, according to all traditional understandings, it's talking about how much money you spend to celebrate the Sabbath, and that you shouldn't spend so much that you wind up, and so therefore it's better to eat the same kind of food that you would eat on a weekday if you are too poor to afford the Sabbath food, rather than to beg for charity. And that's also a general good advice, not only about the Sabbath. However, the certain heretics, particularly the Reform movement, said Asay Shabbat Chachol, the way they understood that was to mean it's better to work on the Sabbath than to take charity. But that's not what the Talmud is saying, and the Talmud has no right to override a biblical command that it's prohibited to work on the Sabbath, and that it's a capital offense to perform the prohibited labors on the Sabbath, which is clear from Scripture. So how do they make this claim? And the obvious answer is the Reform, they really don't care. They're not really that religious, or their religious expression takes a different form than the traditional expression. Is at least the best, maybe more politically correct way, because they care about what they see as important and essential. But we see from this how the wording of the Talmud, which could be ambiguous, can easily be misinterpreted, and you just have to use common sense to understand that there's no way that the Talmud would be condoning something that's a basic anathema against anything that's basic biblical Torah idea. It's impossible. There's no right, the Talmud has no right to do that. And so, just like it's obvious that the Bible tells us about the Sabbath, and the Talmud, all throughout the Talmud, explains the laws of the Sabbath in depth, that it's impossible to believe that the intention of Asay Shabbat Chachol, make your Sabbath a weekday, could somehow mean that you could work on the Sabbath. Now, when it comes to life or death, it's a different story. But again, that's proven from a biblical source. If they were trying to uproot a basic biblical commandment, they would need some kind of a biblical citation to do that, which was not brought there. So, obviously, something that's so disgusting and anathema to basic ethics and morals and decency as pedophilia is, and child molestation is, and child rape is, there's no way that the Talmud could possibly condone such a thing. And so if you're translating a passage in the Talmud to mean that, you're obviously translating it wrong. Just like it's obviously translating wrong to say make your Sabbath a weekday to mean that you could work on the Sabbath. There are other examples that are obviously wrong if you're translating it that. So one example that is often quoted by people who have a hatred for our traditions. I'm not going to use the term anti-Semitic because I wouldn't say that they have some racial hatred for Jews, but they have a hatred for the traditional rabbinical Judaism, and perhaps they have a misunderstanding of what it is, and so they believe that, some kind of an ideology that's a sola scriptura ideology that lashes out against traditions that are extra biblical. So a primary example would be where it says that if a girl who is less than 3 years old is violated sexually, it's nothing. And it's like putting your finger in your eye. Now, first of all, putting your finger in your eye is really painful and it's something difficult to do. So obviously that's one part of it, but and it's a stupid thing to do, but it has to be taken in context. What are we talking about here? So the traditional understanding of that statement is as follows. There's consequences of somebody being of a female being a virgin or not, but by an understanding of what was the understanding of medical science at the time when this was written, the understanding here is that if a girl who is less than 3 years old is, God forbid, raped, that she still is considered a virgin, statutorily speaking, and that biologically, even if the hymen is ruptured before that time, it would grow back. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, scientifically speaking, but the point that's being made here is not even really to make a scientific assertion, but rather a statutory one. Certainly, someone who would commit such a crime would be liable to the fullest extent of the law to punishment. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about absolving the rapist. What we're talking about here is the statutory consequences of the victim, that at that age, because of this apparent biological assertion, the victim there would still be statutorily speaking a virgin, and that's really what that statement is. So again, if it's taken at face value without being in context and understood, it could be misinterpreted in a frightening and disgusting way. But that's not what is being said there. What's being said there is really quite the opposite: to protect the victim of such a crime, and not to in any way justify such a thing. And quite often the Talmud speaks in theoretic form. It doesn't necessarily speak in the practical form. So that's an example, and there are many other examples of that. But with that being said, there are clear passages in the Talmud that prohibit all forms of pedophilia, and it even goes to the point of explaining that it's a sin whether the victim is a boy or a girl, whether it is actual intercourse or it's some other form of fondling, etc., that it is an absolute sin. Unequivocally, all different forms are made clear that it's absolutely forbidden. It's a clear statement in the Talmud. It goes through explaining, how all of these different forms of abuse are absolutely sinful and evil, and have a horrible effect on the whole world. So to make these claims, when you don't actually, first of all, when you just read some kind of a tract that was written in Russia, maybe in the 1800s or something, claiming that the Talmud says this and that, and they might actually, a lot of those things are just totally made up, and some of them are actual quotes that are intentionally mistranslated and misinterpreted. But they leave out the fact, these little books that are speaking out against the Talmud, they leave out the rest of the story. The other point of the Talmud that you have to realize is that the Talmud, most of the text of the Talmud, legal discussions and things, it brings various opinions, some of which are rejected. Now, there's no opinion that says that it's permitted to commit such disgusting crimes. So when it comes to that issue, there's nothing to talk about. It's absolutely 100% clear that it's prohibited. Now, again, there's discussion about, is a marriage bond affected? If one would do this, at what age statutorily can a marriage be affected? And what that would also add to it is reasons to be even more careful to avoid such a thing. And also the discussion of how marriage is affected. With all that being said, there was a case in America, I believe in the 1980s, where some evil men were trying to torture their ex-wife and their children by marrying off their minor daughters to men without their knowledge, in order to kind of trap them in a legal fiction sort of trap, for the sake of doing something evil, trying to base themselves in the Talmud that says that a father could marry off his daughter even without her knowledge, and the marriage would be affected. In those cases, there was no actual consummation of the marriage. There was no actual sexual abuse. This was more of a religious, emotional abuse that was historically taking place, and it was a horrible, horrible case. What happened in the end was the great scholars who know the Talmud and know the Code of Jewish Law adjudicated that these marriages were not legally affected for various reasons, not the least of which was that it was not in the interest of the girls to be married to these men that they didn't know, and that the intention of the father in doing such a thing was nefarious, and so therefore it was, from a Talmudic and rabbinical ruling, declared null and void. It's a very complicated issue, and it's a very disgusting and horrible case. But with that being said, it should be noted that with this horrible case that did happen historically, there was no actual sexual abuse that took place, but rather emotional and religious abuse. It's not a term usually here, religious abuse, but it was religious abuse. Now, unfortunately, of course, there are problems with pedophilia in the world, but I don't know anybody who justifies such a crime based in the Talmud. There's no, even interpreting it wrongly, and so you can't blame this text of the Talmud for this sickness that exists in the world that we have to work to eradicate, and send these people to prison. There's no, you know, a lot of the cases that get media attention where people are fighting to get people out of prison are cases where it's generally believed that the person who was arrested was framed and is actually innocent. Whereas when there are cases that are clear, you don't have these things happening. And it could be, that the people are wrong and that they're judging favorably someone who maybe is guilty, but it's not. Nobody is justifying this based on anything that's in the Talmud. That's a horrible lie, and there's no basis to teach anything like that. You asked about racism. That kind of goes back to more what we were saying before, how much of what is in the Talmud is dismissed, which we'll have to make another video on that subject. It's a very important subject. But for the most part, if anything, the Talmud removed a lot of the racism of the Bible, to be honest, through biblical scholarship. And a lot of the things that are called racist are actually really religious, maybe discrimination, but not racial, because anyone from any race could convert to Judaism. And a lot of the things that exist that are even religiously based, this was before the spread of Christianity and before the invention of Islam. So we're not talking about, even though there was a small Christian community, there really wasn't the interaction between the Jewish community and the Christian community at the time. And so we're not talking about monotheists. Generally, we're talking about Roman pagans who had no idea of human rights. So it wasn't a jab at people for being not Jewish, but rather because of the lack of the idea of human rights among the Roman pagans, which of course when Christianity became the dominant religion in Rome and the official religion in Rome, that really came to an end. And so a lot of the rabbis applauded Christianity for fixing the Gentile world, and to the point where it even influenced people who remained pagans to a certain extent, although not always. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. We'll see you later.